Sometimes fate has a twisted sense of humor. One moment you're screaming at a young waitress because your champagne isn't cold enough, and the next, you're drowning in the dark waters of the Pacific, praying that someone, anyone, will save your worthless life. But what happens when the person holding the rope that could pull you from death's grip is the same person you humiliated just hours before? This is the story of Richard Blackstone, a tech billionaire worth $2 billion, who learned the hardest lesson of his life while salt water filled his lungs and his luxury yacht disappeared beneath the waves. A man who thought money could buy him respect, dignity, and the right to treat others like garbage. Until the night when Mother Nature decided to teach him otherwise. But here's the twist that will leave you speechless. The young woman he screamed at, called worthless, and tried to get fired, turned out to be someone he never expected. Someone whose hands would literally hold his life just 3 hours after he tried to destroy hers. Because sometimes, the universe has a way of balancing the scales in the most unexpected ways. What you're about to hear isn't just another rich man's downfall. It's a story about the thin line between life and death, about how one moment of cruelty can come back to haunt you when you least expect it, and about a second chance that came with a price tag no amount of money could ever cover. So buckle up, because this tale will take you from the glittering heights of Silicon Valley arrogance to the crushing depths of the Pacific Ocean, where titles mean nothing and survival depends on the mercy of those we've wronged. Richard Blackstone built his empire on the simple belief that he was better than everyone else. At 52, he had everything money could buy: a penthouse overlooking San Francisco Bay, a collection of supercars that cost more than most people's houses, and a yacht that looked like a floating palace. But what he valued most was the power to make others feel small. His tech company, Nexus Systems, had revolutionized cloud computing, making him one of the youngest billionaires in Silicon Valley. Success, however, had rotted his soul from the inside out. Richard saw people as either useful tools or insignificant obstacles. There was no in-between in his world. On this particular Friday evening in September, Richard had chosen Marina Bay Restaurant for what he called a power dinner with potential investors from Tokyo. The restaurant, perched on Pier 19, offered stunning views of the bay and was known for its impeccable service. It was exactly the kind of place where Richard felt he belonged, expensive, exclusive, and intimidating to ordinary people. He arrived 30 minutes late, as was his custom. Making others wait was just another way to demonstrate his importance. His black Lamborghini screeched to a halt in front of the valet stand, and he tossed the keys to the young attendant without even looking at him. Inside, the restaurant buzzed with the quiet conversations of San Francisco's elite. Crystal glasses clinked softly, and the aroma of aged wine mixed with the salt air drifting through the windows. Richard strode to his reserved table, the best one in the house, overlooking the marina where million-dollar yachts bobbed gently in their slips. The Japanese investors were already seated, their faces politely masking their annoyance at his tardiness. Richard didn't apologize. In his mind, they should feel honored to wait for him. "Gentlemen," he said, sliding into his chair with theatrical confidence, "I hope you're ready to discuss the future of technology." The evening started smoothly enough. Richard ordered the most expensive wine on the menu, a 1982 Bordeaux that cost more than most people's monthly salary. He launched into his well-rehearsed pitch about Nexus Systems' latest innovations, his voice carrying across the dining room with the authority of someone who had never been told no. But then the champagne arrived, and everything began to unravel. Sarah Chen had been working at Marina Bay Restaurant for 8 months, saving every penny for her Coast Guard training program. At 24, she was putting herself through college while working nights to support her younger brother's medical expenses. The restaurant job was temporary, a stepping stone toward her real dream of becoming a rescue swimmer. Sarah took pride in her work, treating every customer with genuine care and attention. She had memorized the wine list, studied food pairings, and could recite the ingredients of every dish from memory. Her colleagues respected her, and the regular customers often requested her section. When she approached Richard's table with the champagne service, she moved with practiced grace, the bottle chilled to exactly 38 degrees Fahrenheit, just as the sommelier had taught her. She presented the label to Richard with a warm smile. "Your Dom Perignon 2010, sir. Would you like to taste it first?" Richard barely glanced at her, his attention focused on impressing his guests with stories of his latest acquisition, a competitor's company he had purchased just to shut it down. Sarah poured a small amount into his glass and stepped back, waiting for his approval. Richard lifted the glass, took a sip, and his face immediately contorted with disgust. The champagne was perfectly fine. In fact, it was exceptional. But Richard had decided this was his moment to demonstrate his superiority, to show the Japanese investors how demanding and discerning he was. "This is garbage," he said loudly, loud enough for nearby tables to turn and stare. "How dare you serve me warm champagne?" Sarah's heart sank. She knew the champagne was perfectly chilled, but she also knew better than to argue with a customer, especially one as obviously important as Richard Blackstone. "I'm so sorry, sir. Let me get you a fresh bottle immediately," she said, reaching for the champagne. "Don't touch it," Richard snapped, his voice rising even higher. "Do you have any idea who I am? I could buy this entire restaurant with the change in my pocket, and you're serving me swill like I'm some nobody from the suburbs." The entire dining room had gone quiet now. Other patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some pulling out their phones to record what was clearly becoming an ugly scene. The Japanese investors looked mortified, whispering among themselves in rapid Japanese. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she maintained her composure. Years of dealing with difficult customers had taught her to stay calm under pressure. "Sir, I understand your frustration. Please allow me to— I don't want to hear your excuses, Richard interrupted, standing up from his chair so abruptly that it scraped loudly against the floor. You people are all the same. Lazy, incompetent, and completely worthless. You probably didn't even finish high school, did you? The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She thought about her engineering degree, her acceptance into the Coast Guard program, the years she had spent studying while working multiple jobs. But she couldn't defend herself without risking her job, and she needed this job desperately. I'll get the manager, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Oh, you'll get the manager all right, Richard snarled, because I'm going to make sure you never work in this city again. People like you need to learn their place in the world. He turned to his guests, his voice dripping with contempt. This is exactly what's wrong with America today. No work ethic, no standards, no respect for their betters. What Richard didn't know was that Sarah's place in the world was quite different from what he imagined. While he was busy humiliating her in front of a room full of strangers, Sarah was thinking about her upcoming Coast Guard certification exam, about the rescue swimming techniques she had been practicing every morning at 5 a.m. before her restaurant shifts. She was thinking about the lives she hoped to save, the families she wanted to reunite, and the difference she planned to make in the world. She was thinking about everything except revenge, because that wasn't who Sarah Chen was. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. The manager, a dignified man named Thomas who had run high-end restaurants for 30 years, appeared at the table within moments. He had witnessed the entire scene from across the dining room, and his face was tight with controlled anger. Mr. Blackstone, he said formally, I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience. Sarah is one of our finest servers, but if there's been an issue with your service, we'll certainly address it. Richard wasn't finished. He was enjoying the power rush, the feeling of having an entire room's attention, the way everyone was watching him assert his dominance. Address it? I want her fired. Right now, in front of everyone. Maybe that will teach the rest of your staff what happens when they disrespect someone of my caliber. Thomas glanced at Sarah, who stood perfectly still, despite the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. He had seen her work double shifts when her colleagues called in sick, had watched her study textbooks during her breaks, had heard her take phone calls from her brother's doctors during her lunch hour. I'm afraid I can't do that, sir, Thomas said quietly. Sarah is an exemplary employee, and frankly, the champagne service was flawless. Perhaps we could offer you a different bottle, or maybe you'd prefer to move to a private dining room. Richard's face turned red with rage. Being contradicted, especially in public, was something his ego simply couldn't tolerate. Fine, he spat. Keep your worthless employee. But you've just lost a customer who spends more money here in one night than she makes in a year. And I'll make sure everyone in this city knows exactly what kind of establishment you're running. He threw a handful of cash on the table, far less than the bill would have been, and stormed toward the exit, his humiliated guests trailing behind him. As he reached the door, he turned back one final time. "Enjoy your pathetic little life," he called out to Sarah. "Some people are born to serve, and some are born to be served. Learn the difference." The door slammed behind him with such force that the windows rattled. The dining room remained silent for several long moments before conversations gradually resumed, though everyone kept glancing at Sarah with mixtures of sympathy and admiration for how she had handled the situation. Sarah excused herself to the employee break room, where she finally allowed herself to cry. Not from humiliation, she had dealt with difficult customers before. She cried from frustration, from the unfairness of a world where people like Richard Blackstone could destroy others simply because they had money, and from the helpless feeling that there was nothing she could do about it. But sometimes the universe listens to our tears. Sometimes it takes note of injustice and decides to intervene in ways we never expect. As Sarah composed herself in the break room, Richard was already on his yacht, planning to set sail for a weekend party in international waters. His mega yacht, Domination, was his pride and joy. 200 feet of pure luxury, equipped with every amenable money could buy. He had invited a dozen of his Silicon Valley cronies for what he called a networking cruise, though it was really just an excuse to show off his wealth and discuss ways to increase it. The yacht was stocked with premium liquor, gourmet food prepared by a private chef, and enough recreational substances to keep his guests entertained for days. As the sun began to set over San Francisco Bay, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Richard stood on the yacht's upper deck, a glass of whiskey in his hand, feeling absolutely invincible. The incident at the restaurant was already forgotten, just another insignificant interaction with an insignificant person. He had no idea that Sarah Chen was at that very moment changing into her Coast Guard training gear, preparing for her evening shift with the San Francisco Bay Rescue Unit. As a trainee rescue swimmer, she was on call for emergencies, practicing the skills that would soon make her one of the most capable lifesavers on the West Coast. Richard also had no idea that the Weather Service had issued a severe storm warning for the area where he planned to anchor his yacht. His captain had mentioned it, but Richard had dismissed the warning as overcautious nonsense. After all, he owned the most advanced yacht money could buy, with every safety feature and navigation system available. What could possibly go wrong? As Domination left the marina, its powerful engines purring like satisfied cats, Richard raised his glass in a mock toast to the city lights beginning to twinkle in the distance. "To being better than everyone else," he said to his guests, who laughed and clinked their glasses against his. None of them noticed the dark clouds gathering on the horizon, or the way the wind was beginning to pick up, sending larger waves crashing against the yacht's hull. They were too busy celebrating their superiority to pay attention to the forces of nature that don't care about bank account balances. The Pacific Ocean, as it turns out, is remarkably democratic. It treats billionaires and waitresses exactly the same when the weather turns violent. And the weather was about to turn very violent indeed. 20 miles offshore, Richard's party was in full swing. The yacht's sound system pumped electronic music across the water, while his guests danced on the main deck, their laughter mixing with the sound of waves against the hull. The yacht's chef had prepared an elaborate dinner, and the bar was stocked with bottles that cost more than most people's cars. Richard held court in the center of it all, regaling his friends with exaggerated stories of his business conquests. He was in the middle of describing how he had acquired a startup company just to steal their best engineers when the first real wave hit. The yacht lurched violently to starboard, sending glasses flying and causing several guests to stumble. The music stopped abruptly as everyone grabbed for something to steady themselves. "What the hell was that?" shouted Brandon, one of Richard's business partners, his face pale with sudden fear. "Probably just a rogue wave," Richard said dismissively, though he noticed that his own voice sounded less confident than usual. "This boat can handle anything the ocean throws at it." But even as he spoke, the wind was picking up dramatically, and the swells were growing larger and more frequent. The yacht's captain, an experienced man named Pete Rodriguez, appeared on deck looking deeply concerned. "Mr. Blackstone," he called over the growing wind, "we need to head back to shore immediately. The weather service is reporting 40-foot swells and winds up to 70 miles per hour. This storm came out of nowhere." Richard's first instinct was to argue, to assert his authority as he did in every other situation. But the fear in Captain Rodriguez's voice was unmistakable, and even Richard wasn't stupid enough to ignore a maritime expert during a storm. "Fine," he said, trying to sound casual in front of his guests, "but make it smooth. I don't want to spill anyone's drink." It was the last joke he would make for a very long time. Within minutes, the storm hit with the fury of 1,000 demons. Waves 30 feet high crashed over the yacht's bow, sending torrents of seawater across the deck. The wind howled like a living thing, drowning out the screams of the terrified guests as they struggled to get below deck. Richard's magnificent yacht, his symbol of power and success, was suddenly revealed to be nothing more than a very expensive piece of metal being tossed around by forces beyond human control. The sophisticated stabilization systems, the advanced navigation equipment, the redundant safety features, none of it mattered when Mother Nature decided to show her true power. Captain Rodriguez fought desperately to maintain control, his hands flying over the yacht's controls as he tried to keep the bow pointed into the waves. But the storm was too powerful, the seas too violent. With each passing minute, the situation grew more desperate. "Mayday, mayday," Rodriguez spoke into the radio, his voice calm despite the chaos around him. "This is the Yacht Domination, 20 miles southwest of San Francisco. We are taking on water and requesting immediate assistance." "Repeat, we are in distress and need immediate rescue." The response came through the static. "Domination, this is Coast Guard Station San Francisco. We have your position and are dispatching rescue vessels. Prepare for evacuation procedures." Below deck, Richard's guests huddled in terror as the yacht pitched and rolled with each massive wave, the sounds of expensive items crashing to the floor mixed with the groaning of the hull under stress. Water was beginning to seep in through hairline cracks that appeared as the yacht flexed beyond its design limits. Richard himself sat in stunned silence, his face white with fear. For the first time in his adult life, his money meant absolutely nothing. His connections, his influence, his ability to intimidate and control, all of it was worthless against the raw power of the storm. The yacht was dying beneath them, and there was nothing any of them could do but wait for help to arrive. At Coast Guard Station San Francisco, the emergency call triggered immediate action. Within minutes, rescue helicopters were being prepped for launch, and the fastest response boat in the fleet was racing toward the storm. Sarah Chen was in the middle of a training exercise when the alarm sounded. She had spent the evening practicing rescue scenarios in the station's pool, perfecting the techniques that could mean the difference between life and death in real emergencies. "All hands, we have a mayday call," announced Lieutenant Commander Maria Santos over the intercom. "Yacht in distress 20 miles out, multiple souls on board. Chen, you're up. This is not a drill." Sarah's heart raced as she pulled on her wetsuit and checked her equipment. This would be her first real rescue mission, the moment she had been training for since joining the Coast Guard program. As she ran toward the helicopter pad, she had no idea that the person whose life she was about to risk her own to save was the same man who had tried to destroy her just hours earlier. The rescue helicopter lifted off into the storm, its rotors struggling against the fierce winds. Sarah sat in the back, going over rescue procedures in her mind, preparing herself for what she knew would be the most challenging situation of her young career. Through the helicopter's window, she could see the storm raging across the bay, waves crashing against the shoreline with unprecedented fury. Somewhere out there in that chaos, people were fighting for their lives, and it was her job to bring them home safely. The helicopter pilot, Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison, was a 20-year veteran who had seen every kind of emergency the ocean could produce. Even he was impressed by the ferocity of this particular storm. "It's a big one out there, Chen," he called back to Sarah over the noise of the rotors. "You ready for this?" Sarah checked her harness one final time and gave him a thumbs up. "Ready, Chief." What she wasn't ready for was the shock of recognition that would hit her when she saw the face of the first person she would pull from the water. The yacht Domination was listing badly to port when the Coast Guard helicopter arrived on scene. Half of the upper deck had been swept away by the waves, and the hull was cracked in several places. It was clear that the vessel had only minutes left before it would slip beneath the surface. Captain Rodriguez had managed to get most of the passengers into life jackets and onto the remaining section of deck, but the yacht was rolling so violently that staying aboard was becoming impossible. One by one, the terrified passengers were being thrown into the churning sea. Sarah could see them from the helicopter, a dozen people scattered across the water, some clinging to debris, others struggling to stay afloat in the massive swells. It was a rescue swimmer's nightmare scenario, but she didn't hesitate. "Taking me down, Chief," she called to Morrison, who brought the helicopter into position despite the incredible difficulty of maintaining stable flight in the storm conditions. Sarah clipped into the rescue hoist and dropped toward the chaos below. The wind buffeted her as she descended, and the sea spray stung her face, but her training took over. She hit the water with practiced precision and immediately began swimming toward the nearest victim. The first person she reached was a middle-aged woman who was barely conscious, her life jacket keeping her afloat, but her strength nearly gone. Sarah secured the rescue harness around her and signaled for her to be lifted to safety. One by one, Sarah pulled the survivors from the water. Each rescue was a battle against the storm, against exhaustion, against the very real possibility that the next wave could be the one that overwhelmed them both. But Sarah never wavered, never hesitated, never gave up. She was on her 6th rescue when she saw him. Richard Blackstone was clinging to a piece of debris about 50 yards away, his expensive suit torn and waterlogged, his face a mask of pure terror. He was barely keeping his head above water, and Sarah could see that he wouldn't last much longer. For a split second she froze. The memory of his cruelty, his arrogance, his deliberate attempt to destroy her career flashed through her mind. This was the man who had called her worthless, who had tried to get her fired, who had treated her like she was less than human. But the moment passed as quickly as it had come. Sarah Chen had not trained to become a Coast Guard rescue swimmer, so she could choose who deserved to be saved. She had trained to save lives, period. Even the life of someone who had treated her with contempt. She swam toward Richard with the same determination she had shown for every other victim, fighting through the churning water as waves crashed over both of them. When she reached him, his eyes were wide with panic and approaching hypothermia. "I've got you," she shouted over the wind. "You're going to be okay." Richard was so disoriented that he didn't recognize her at first. All he saw was the angel of mercy, who had appeared to save him from certain death. He grabbed onto her with desperate strength as she worked to secure the rescue harness around his chest. It wasn't until they were both being lifted toward the helicopter that recognition dawned in his eyes. The young woman who was risking her life to save his was the same person he had humiliated and degraded just hours earlier. "You," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. Sarah met his gaze steadily as they rose through the air, both of them battered by wind and spray. "Yes," she said simply, "it's me." In that moment, suspended between the churning sea and the storm-filled sky, Richard Blackstone experienced something he had never felt before: complete and utter shame. Not embarrassment at being caught in a mistake, not frustration at a business deal gone wrong, but genuine soul-deep shame at the kind of person he had become. The woman who was literally saving his life was someone he had tried to destroy simply because he could. She had every reason to let him drown, every justification to look the other way and focus on saving someone more deserving. But she hadn't. She had risked her own life to save his, without hesitation, without conditions, without any expectation of reward or recognition. As they were pulled into the helicopter, Richard tried to speak, to say something, anything, that might begin to express what he was feeling, but no words came. How do you apologize to someone for your entire worldview? How do you thank someone for showing you a kind of humanity you had never believed existed? Sarah worked efficiently to stabilize him, checking his vital signs and wrapping him in thermal blankets. Her training had kicked in completely now, and she treated him with the same professional care she had given every other survivor. But Richard could see something in her eyes, not hatred or satisfaction at his humiliation, but something much more devastating. Disappointment. She had expected better from him. Even after everything he had done, some part of her had believed that people were fundamentally good, that everyone deserved compassion and respect. His behavior at the restaurant hadn't just hurt her feelings, it had damaged her faith in humanity itself. And somehow that realization hurt Richard more than drowning would have. The helicopter fight back to shore passed in relative silence. The other survivors were too exhausted and traumatized to speak much, and Richard was lost in thoughts darker than the storm clouds surrounding them. For the first time in decades, he was forced to confront the reality of who he had become and what his life actually meant. When they landed at the Coast Guard station, paramedics were waiting to check each survivor for injuries and hypothermia. Richard was physically fine, shaken and exhausted but unharmed. Emotionally, however, he was devastated in ways he was only beginning to understand. As he was being processed through the standard post-rescue procedures, he watched Sarah preparing for another mission. The helicopter was being refueled and restocked because there were other emergency calls coming in from the storm. Without taking any time to rest or recover, she was getting ready to go back out into the chaos to save more lives. "Excuse me," Richard called to one of the Coast Guard officers. "The woman who rescued me, Sarah, how long has she been doing this?" The officer, a gruff veteran named Sergeant Murphy, looked at Richard with barely concealed contempt. Word had already spread through the station about the incident at the restaurant earlier that evening. "She's not even officially graduated yet," Murphy said coldly. "Tonight was her first real rescue mission, but she pulled 11 people out of that water, including your sorry ass. You might want to think about that before you go calling anyone worthless again." The words hit Richard like physical blows. Sarah's first mission. She had risked her life to save a dozen strangers, including him, and it was her first time doing the job for real. While he had been living in luxury and treating people like servants, she had been training to dedicate her life to saving others. Richard spent the next several hours at the Coast Guard station, waiting for the storm to pass and trying to process what had happened to him. He watched through the windows as rescue teams continued to respond to emergency calls throughout the night. Sarah went out on 2 more missions, bringing home fishermen whose boat had capsized and a family whose sailboat had been driven onto the rocks. Each time she returned, exhausted and soaked but ready for the next call, Richard felt the weight of his own selfishness growing heavier. He thought about his yacht, now resting on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, and realized that losing it meant nothing to him. What meant something, what was eating him alive, was the memory of Sarah's face when he had called her worthless. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a city cleaning up debris and counting its blessings. Richard's business associates had all been rescued safely, though several of them were hospitalized for hypothermia and shock. The yacht was a total loss, along with everything aboard it, but the insurance would cover the financial damage. The personal damage, however, was something no policy could repair. As Richard prepared to leave the Coast Guard station, he saw Sarah in the break room, finally taking a few minutes to rest after working through the entire night. She was still in her wetsuit, her hair damp with seawater, studying what looked like a textbook while eating a sandwich. He approached her slowly, uncertain of what to say, but knowing he had to say something. "Sarah," he began, his voice hoarse from the salt water and exhaustion. She looked up from her book, her expression neutral but wary. "Mr. Blackstone," she said politely, "I'm glad you're okay." The simple kindness in her voice nearly broke him. After everything he had done, she was still treating him with basic human decency, the same decency he had refused to show her. "I wanted to thank you," he said awkwardly, "for saving my life. And I need to apologize for earlier." "At the restaurant, the way I treated you was inexcusable." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether his remorse was genuine. Finally, she nodded slightly. "Apology accepted," she said quietly. "But I didn't save you because I forgave you, Mr. Blackstone. I saved you because that's what I'm trained to do. It's who I choose to be." The emphasis on the word choose wasn't lost on Richard. She was telling him that being a good person was a choice, one that she made every day, and one that he had been failing to make for years. "I know," he said, "and that makes what you did even more remarkable. You're an extraordinary person, Sarah. I was wrong about everything I said, dead wrong." Sarah closed her textbook and looked at him directly. "Mr. Blackstone, I don't need you to tell me my worth. I never did." But there are a lot of people in this world who do need to hear that they matter, that they deserve respect regardless of their job title or bank account. If you really want to apologize, maybe start there. With that, she stood up and walked away, leaving Richard alone with the most important lesson he had ever received. The story of Richard Blackstone's rescue spread quickly through social media, but not in the way he might have expected. Someone at the restaurant had recorded his cruel treatment of Sarah, and when word got out that she had been the one to save him from drowning, the video went viral with a vengeance. The internet's response was swift and merciless. Karma Knows began trending worldwide, with millions of people sharing the story as an example of poetic justice. Richard's business reputation, built on decades of ruthless success, crumbled virtually overnight. Major news networks picked up the story, interviewing Sarah about her heroism and contrasting it with Richard's behavior at the restaurant. She handled the attention with the same grace she had shown during the rescue, deflecting praise and emphasizing the importance of treating all people with dignity. "Everyone deserves to be treated with basic respect," she told CNN in an interview that was viewed by millions. "I don't think Mr. Blackstone is a bad person. I think he's someone who lost sight of what really matters in life. We all make mistakes. The question is what we do after we realize we've made them." Richard watched the interview from his penthouse apartment, which suddenly felt more like a prison than a palace. His phone had been ringing constantly with calls from reporters, business associates, and board members demanding explanations. His company's stock price had dropped 15% in 2 days, and several major clients were reconsidering their contracts. But none of that bothered him as much as seeing the pain in Sarah's eyes when she talked about the importance of treating people with dignity. He had caused that pain, and no amount of money or power could undo it. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Blackstone had to confront the possibility that he was not the hero of his own story. He was the villain, and everyone could see it. The transformation didn't happen overnight. For weeks after the rescue, Richard struggled with depression and a crisis of identity that shook him to his core. His therapist, Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the first therapist he had ever consulted in his life, helped him understand that his behavior patterns had been building for decades. "You've spent so many years defining yourself by your superiority to others," she explained during one of their sessions, "that you've forgotten how to connect with people as equals. The rescue forced you to see yourself through Sarah's eyes, and you didn't like what you saw." Richard nodded, staring out the window at the bay where he had nearly died. "I've been thinking about that moment when she pulled me from the water." "She had every reason to hate me, to let me drown, to feel satisfaction at my suffering, but there wasn't an ounce of cruelty in her. Even after what I did to her, she still saw me as someone worth saving." "And how does that make you feel?" Dr. Warren asked. "Ashamed," Richard said quietly, "and grateful, and confused about how to become the kind of person who deserves that kind of compassion." The road to redemption proved to be longer and more difficult than Richard had anticipated. His first instinct was to try to buy his way back to respectability, make a large donation to the Coast Guard, offer Sarah a high-paying job at his company, throw money at various charities until people forgot about his behavior. But Sarah's words kept echoing in his mind. If you really want to apologize, maybe start there. She hadn't been talking about apologizing to her. She had been talking about changing how he treated everyone. So Richard began the slow, humbling process of learning to see other people as human beings rather than tools or obstacles. He started small, saying please and thank you to his household staff, asking his secretary about her weekend plans, actually listening when people spoke to him. The changes were noticed immediately by everyone around him, though their reactions varied. Some employees were suspicious, wondering what angle he was playing. Others were cautiously optimistic that their boss might finally be becoming tolerable to work with. Richard's biggest test came 2 months after the rescue, when he decided to return to Marina Bay Restaurant. He hadn't been back since that terrible evening, but he knew he needed to face the scene of his worst behavior if he was going to move forward. The restaurant manager, Thomas, recognized him immediately and approached his table with obvious wariness. "Mr." "Blackstone," Thomas said carefully, "I'm surprised to see you back." "I wanted to apologize," Richard said, standing up from his chair. "To you, to your staff, and to everyone who witnessed my behavior that night. There's no excuse for how I acted, and I'm sorry." Thomas studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity or manipulation, but what he saw was genuine remorse and something he had never seen in Richard Blackstone before: humility. "I appreciate that," Thomas said finally. "That takes courage." Richard shook his head. "No, it doesn't. Courage is jumping into a storm to save strangers. This is just basic decency, which I should have shown months ago." Word of Richard's apology spread through the restaurant industry, and then through social media, and then through the broader business community. Some people dismissed it as a publicity stunt, but others began to notice more substantial changes in how he conducted himself and his business. Richard implemented new policies at Nexus Systems, focused on employee welfare and work-life balance. He established a scholarship fund for people pursuing careers in public service. He began volunteering at a local homeless shelter, not for the photo opportunities, but because he wanted to understand what life was like for people without his advantages. Most importantly, he began treating everyone he encountered, from CEOs to janitors, with the same basic respect and courtesy. It wasn't always easy, and he didn't always get it right, but he kept trying. The changes in Richard's behavior were noticed by Sarah as well, though she tried to stay out of the media coverage surrounding their story. She had completed her Coast Guard training and was now a full-time rescue swimmer, saving lives and serving her community as she had always dreamed of doing. 1 year after the rescue, Richard received a letter that would change his life once again. It was from Sarah, and it was brief. "Mr. Blackstone, I wanted you to know that I've been following the changes you've made since the rescue. My colleagues at the Coast Guard have told me about the scholarship program, and I've seen news reports about your volunteer work. I think you should know that these actions mean more to me than any apology ever could. You asked me once what kind of person deserves compassion. I think the answer is anyone who's willing to grow, to admit their mistakes, and to spend their life trying to do better. You're becoming that kind of person. I hope we can meet again someday under better circumstances. With respect, Sarah Chen. Richard read the letter dozens of times, each reading bringing fresh tears to his eyes. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was something more valuable, recognition that he was capable of change, that he was becoming someone worthy of respect. Two years after nearly drowning in the Pacific Ocean, Richard Blackstone stood at the podium of the Coast Guard Academy graduation ceremony. He had been invited to speak not as a celebrity survivor, but as someone whose life had been fundamentally changed by the service and sacrifice of the Coast Guard. The auditorium was filled with families, friends, and new graduates ready to dedicate their lives to saving others. In the third row, Sarah Chen sat with her family, now a decorated petty officer with multiple successful rescues to her credit. 2 years ago, Richard began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, I was a different person. I measured my worth by my wealth, my success by my ability to make others feel small, and my importance by how much fear and respect I could command through intimidation. He paused, looking out at the sea of young faces preparing to serve their country. I thought I was living, but I was really just existing in a bubble of my own arrogance. It took nearly dying and being saved by someone I had treated with contempt to understand what life actually means. Richard's eyes found Sarah in the audience. She gave him a small nod of encouragement. The person who pulled me from those dark waters that night didn't save me because I deserved it. She saved me because she had chosen to dedicate her life to seeing the worth in every human being, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. That's not just heroism. That's the highest form of humanity. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. I spent decades building an empire of money and power, but it was Sarah Chen who taught me how to build something that actually matters, a life worth living. She showed me that true strength isn't about dominating others. It's about lifting them up. Real power isn't about making people fear you. It's about inspiring them to be better than they thought possible. Richard's voice grew stronger as he continued. To the graduates here today, you're about to embark on careers that will literally save lives. But I want you to know that you'll be saving more than just the people you pull from the water or rescue from burning buildings. You'll be saving their faith in humanity itself. You'll be proving that there are still people in this world who put service above self, who risk everything for strangers, who choose compassion over cruelty every single day. He looked directly at Sarah again. 2 years ago, I called someone worthless who turned out to be worth more than I could have ever imagined. Don't make my mistake. See the value in every person you encounter, because you never know who might end up saving your life, or better yet, your soul." The applause was thunderous and sustained. As Richard stepped down from the podium, he was approached by dozens of graduates and their families, all wanting to thank him for his honesty and his message of redemption. But the conversation that mattered most came later, outside the ceremony hall, when Sarah finally approached him. "That was a beautiful speech," she said, extending her hand. Richard shook it gratefully. "I meant every word, and I meant what I said about you in particular. You didn't just save my life that night, Sarah. You saved my humanity." Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile she had ever given him. "I think you saved that yourself, Mr. Blackstone. I just gave you the chance to find it." They talked for nearly an hour, not as the billionaire and the waitress, not as the victim and the rescuer, but as two people who had both learned important lessons about what it means to be human. Richard learned about Sarah's work with the Coast Guard, her plans to become a rescue coordination specialist, and her dreams of improving maritime safety protocols. Sarah learned about Richard's scholarship program, which had grown to support over 100 young people pursuing careers in public service. She heard about his volunteer work, his efforts to change the culture at his company, and his ongoing therapy to address the childhood traumas that had made him so desperate to feel superior to others. "I have one more question," Sarah said, as their conversation was winding down. "That night at the restaurant, why did you really treat me that way? It wasn't about the champagne, was it?" Richard was quiet for a long moment, gathering the courage to be completely honest. "I was terrified," he said finally. "My business was facing some serious challenges. The Japanese investors were asking hard questions I couldn't answer, and I felt like my whole world was starting to crumble." "I took it out on you because you were safe. Someone I thought couldn't fight back, couldn't hurt me in return." He shook his head in shame. "I turned you into a target for all my fear and insecurity, and that was unforgivable. You didn't deserve to pay the price for my cowardice." Sarah nodded, appreciating his honesty. "Thank you for telling me that. It helps me understand, even if it doesn't excuse the behavior." "It doesn't," Richard agreed. "And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make sure I never make someone else pay for my problems again." As they parted ways that evening, both Richard and Sarah felt a sense of closure that had been missing for 2 years. The story that had begun with cruelty and nearly ended in tragedy had somehow transformed into something redemptive, proof that people can change, that second chances matter, and that sometimes the universe conspires to teach us exactly the lessons we need to learn. Richard returned to his life as a businessman and philanthropist, but with a fundamentally different understanding of what success actually means. He built his company into one of the most employee-friendly in Silicon Valley, funded countless charitable initiatives, and became known as much for his humanity as for his business acumen. Sarah continued her career with the Coast Guard, eventually becoming one of the youngest rescue coordination specialists in the service's history. She saved hundreds of lives over the years, but she never forgot the lesson she had learned that stormy night, that sometimes the most important rescue is helping someone find their way back to their own humanity. Years later, when reporters would ask them about that night, both Richard and Sarah would give similar answers. The storm, they would say, wasn't just about wind and waves. It was about the forces that can tear people apart and the choices that can bring them back together. Richard would always credit Sarah with saving his life twice, once from the ocean and once from himself. Sarah would always insist that Richard had done the hardest work of changing who he was and that she had simply given him the opportunity. The truth, as is often the case, lay somewhere in between. On that terrible, wonderful night in the Pacific, two people discovered who they really were beneath the roles they played and the masks they wore. One discovered that he was capable of cruelty beyond measure, but also of growth beyond what he had thought possible. The other discovered that her compassion was stronger than her anger, and that mercy is often the most powerful force in the world. Their story became more than just a tale of rescue and redemption. It became a reminder that we are all capable of both great harm and great good, and that the choice between them defines not just who we are, but who we can become. In the end, the storm passed, as storms always do, but the changes it brought, to two lives, to countless others who heard their story, and to everyone who understood its deeper meaning, those changes were permanent. Sometimes it takes drowning to learn how to breathe. Sometimes it takes losing everything to understand what really matters. And sometimes it takes the compassion of someone we've wronged to show us the way back to our better selves. The Pacific Ocean is vast and unforgiving, but it's also capable of washing things clean. On that night 2 years ago, it washed away Richard Blackstone's yacht, his arrogance and his illusions about what made him valuable as a human being. What it left behind was something far more precious, the possibility of redemption, the power of forgiveness, and the understanding that we are all, in the end, just people trying to stay afloat in the storms of life. The best among us, like Sarah Chen, are the ones who reach out their hands to pull others to safety, regardless of whether they deserve it. And the luckiest among us, like Richard Blackstone, are the ones who get the chance to become worthy of that kindness. Their story proves that it's never too late to change, never too late to apologize, and never too late to become the person you should have been all along. All it takes is the courage to admit you were wrong, the humility to accept help from those you've hurt, and the determination to spend the rest of your life making sure you never make the same mistakes again. In a world that often seems divided by anger and hatred, their story is a reminder that compassion can triumph over cruelty, that understanding can overcome prejudice, and that even the most unlikely people can find their way to redemption. After all, we're all just riding out the storm together. The least we can do is help each other stay afloat.